May 1945. The rain-soaked hills of Okinawa. For Sergeant Matsui, commander of a Type 92 heavy machine gun, the position is perfect. His crew is dug deep into a reverse-slope bunker, shielded by coral and mud, completely immune to the American artillery shells thudding harmlessly into the ground in front of them. They wait for the infantry assault. Then the sound changes. It is not the whistle of an incoming round, followed by a muffled explosion. It is a sharp, violent crack directly in the air. Then another, and another. An impossibly precise rain of shrapnel pours down from the sky into their fortification. Matsui looks at his men, torn apart by steel fragments before a shell has even hit the earth. He stares, horrified, at the sky. The Americans, he realizes, are making their shells explode in midair. A magic that makes every foxhole, every piece of cover, utterly useless. The problem began with artillery itself. For centuries, gunners faced an intractable problem: how to kill a target that had dug in. A single soldier in a foxhole, or a machine gun crew in a fortified bunker, was almost completely safe from traditional shell fire. Armies had two basic types of fuses, and both were flawed. The first was the impact fuse. It exploded on contact. But if a shell landed in soft mud, snow, or even thick jungle canopy, the explosion was smothered, rendered harmless. If it struck hard ground, the shrapnel fanned out horizontally or up, whistling uselessly over the heads of soldiers who were safely hunkered just a few feet below the surface. To kill a bunker, a shell required a direct, pinpoint hit, a statistical impossibility. The second, more complex, was the time fuse. In theory, this was a solution. By setting a shell to detonate after a specific number of seconds, a gunner could try to create an airburst directly above the target. But in practice, it was a nightmare of imprecision. It demanded perfect calculation. The gunner had to know the exact time of flight to the target, which was affected by the slightest variations in powder charge, barrel temperature, air density, and wind. The fuse setter had to work with fractions of a second. The tiniest error, and the shell either exploded too high, a harmless puff of smoke, or too late, becoming just another useless impact round. Throughout the First World War and the opening years of the Second, an effective airburst was a rare stroke of luck, not a reliable tactic. Soldiers on every front knew this. They were trained to dig in. The sound of incoming artillery was the signal to get low and trust the earth to protect them. Safety was down. No one understood this better than the Imperial Japanese Army. They were masters of defensive fortification. As they occupied islands across the Pacific, they didn't just dig trenches. They dug cave systems, interconnected bunkers, and expertly concealed machine gun posts, often on reverse slopes, shielded from direct fire. The Japanese doctrine was to weather the furious American bombardments, hiding deep, and then emerge to slaughter the Marines and GIs who advanced on the cleared positions. In this, their confidence was absolute. They believed they were untouchable. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, a small group of civilian scientists was secretly working to solve this very 1,000-year-old problem. They weren't trying to improve the time fuse. They were trying to create the impossible, a shell that could think. The solution came not from a military arsenal, but from a civilian office. In 1940, even before the United States had entered the war, top scientists had convinced President Roosevelt to establish a new organization, the Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD. Its mission? To mobilize the full power of American civilian science for war. Under its director, Vannevar Bush, the OSRD initiated a host of top-secret projects. One of the most sensitive was given to a small group of physicists at Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory, APL. This group, known as Section T, was led by the brilliant physicist Merle Tuve. The challenge they faced was near science fiction. They needed to build a complete radar set, a transmitter, receiver, amplifier, and battery, small enough to fit inside the nose of a 5-inch artillery shell, and it had to survive being fired. This was the Great Barrier. A shell leaving a cannon barrel endures a staggering 20,000 Gs of acceleration, 20,000 times the force of gravity. It also spins at 25,000 revolutions per minute. Simply put, they had to build a delicate pocket radio, then shoot it from a cannon at 3 times the speed of sound, and expect it to not only survive, but to function perfectly and instantly. At the time, vacuum tubes were the most fragile things in electronics. They were made of glass and delicate filaments. Batteries were heavy and unreliable. It was a miracle of miniaturization. Tuve's team had to invent everything from scratch. They created ruggedized vacuum tubes, small as pencil erasers, with their internal components braced for the shock. They invented a special battery, designed to be inert until the shell was fired. The electrolyte was held in small glass ampules. The sheer force of acceleration would shatter the glass, mixing the chemicals and activating the battery instantly. They designed an ingenious circuit. The tiny transmitter would send out a continuous radio wave. As the shell flew, this wave would bounce off the target, be it an aircraft, or in this case, the ground. The receiver would listen for the returning echo. When the returning signal reached a specific strength, meaning the shell was at the exact preset altitude, perhaps 20 or 30 yards above the ground, the circuit would close, detonating the shell. It solved the 1,000-year-old problem. No more time-of-flight calculations, no more worrying about wind or temperature. The shell itself knew precisely when it was just above the target. The project was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, on par with the Manhattan Project and the Enigma codebreakers. Allied leaders knew that if the Axis discovered the technology, they could copy it or develop countermeasures. They gave it a deliberately mundane, deceptive code name, the VT Fuze, for variable time. The name was brilliant, as it implied it was just an improved version of the old mechanical time fuse, completely masking the truth that it was a self-contained radar. By 1943, the weapon was ready, and when it was first introduced, it completely changed the angles of modern warfare. The most staggering thing about the VT Fuze was not just the idea, but its production. The United States had to solve a problem no one had ever faced, mass-producing a complex, delicate electronic device that was designed to be destroyed on its first use. It was a disposable brain. American industry was mobilized. Companies with no connection to armaments, like Sylvania, which made light bulbs, and Crosley, which made radios and refrigerators, were secretly retooled to build the tiny, rugged vacuum tubes. Thousands of workers, mostly women, labored on assembly lines, soldering delicate circuits by hand. They had no idea what they were building. They were simply told it was a critical war component. The problem of safety was paramount. If a VT shell detonated too early, while still in the gun barrel or just in front of American troops, it would be a catastrophe. Engineers designed a series of ingenious safety mechanisms. A mercury switch ensured the circuit could not be completed until the shell was spinning fast enough. A second, inertial-based safety lock prevented arming until the shell had traveled a safe distance from the gun. They had created a device sensitive enough to detect a target, yet robust enough not to kill its own users. By 1944, American factories were churning out these tiny brains at a rate of 40,000 per day. It was a victory of mass production as much as it was a victory of science. On the other side of the Pacific, the doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Army was moving in the exact opposite direction. They did not believe in technology. They believed in endurance and earthworks. Faced with overwhelming American artillery and air power, the standard Japanese defensive strategy was to dig deep. On islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Japanese created masterpieces of defensive engineering. They did not fight on the beaches. They let the Americans land and walk into a kill zone. They dug systems of tunnels, caves, and interconnected bunkers dozens of feet beneath the volcanic rock. These positions were placed on reverse slopes, making them impossible for flat trajectory naval guns or field artillery to hit. Their doctrine was based on one core assumption: artillery shells cannot turn corners, and they cannot penetrate 30 feet of rock. The Japanese soldier was trained to sit patiently in his bunker during the ferocious preliminary bombardments, which could last for days. He accepted the deafening roar, knowing that as long as he was deep underground, he was safe. His security was measured by the feet of earth above his head. It was this total reliance on fortification that made them the perfect target. They had unwittingly created the ideal laboratory scenario for the VT Fuze. They were concentrating themselves in high densities, in open-topped trenches, bunkers, and foxholes. They were doing exactly what traditional, time-fused artillery could not kill. They were waiting for a weapon that could strike from above. For the American artilleryman, the VT Fuze changed everything. It transformed artillery from an area weapon to a precision killer weapon. Before, barrages were primarily for suppression, forcing the enemy's head down while infantry maneuvered. Actually killing the enemy required a rare direct hit, but with the VT Fuze, the goal was no longer to hit a foxhole. The goal was to saturate the airspace directly above it. Artillery officers quickly developed new tactics. They no longer needed forward observers, FOs, to risk their lives pinpointing the exact location of every single machine gun. A simple report of enemy infantry in trenches at coordinate X was enough. A battery of 105 mm or 155 mm howitzers miles away would fire a VT fused volley. The shells would race in, and instead of harmlessly burying themselves in the ground, they would detonate in unison 30 feet above the earth. Each explosion created a perfect cone of death, spraying hundreds of high-velocity fragments downward at the perfect angle to sweep a trench or foxhole clean. This was time on target, elevated to a new level. Marine commanders called it steel rain. It allowed them to destroy Japanese defensive positions before their own infantry had to assault them. The efficiency increased exponentially. It was estimated that artillery using VT fuses was 7 times more effective against troops in the open than artillery using conventional fuses. For the Japanese soldier, this was a form of technological terror. Warfare, however brutal, had rules. When enemy planes came, you hid. When enemy artillery fired, you jumped in a hole. The earth was your protector. Thousands of years of warfare had taught the soldier one basic truth: digging in meant survival. The VT Fuze broke that covenant. It violated the most fundamental rule of battlefield safety. Imagine being a Japanese machine gunner. You hear the familiar incoming whistle of artillery. You do as you're trained. You duck down, pressing yourself into the bottom of your trench, feeling secure behind the berm of earth. But instead of a muffled thud somewhere in front of you, you hear a deafening, horrific crack directly above you. Before your brain can process the sound, A blizzard of hot shrapnel has descended upon you from above, turning your safe haven into a death trap. This was incomprehensible. It was magic. How could the Americans know the exact altitude of your foxhole? How could they make every shell, every time, explode at the perfect height? The confusion quickly turned to raw horror. Reports from the Pacific described finding Japanese machine gun positions completely intact, with not a single crater around them, yet the entire crew inside was dead. Killed by fragments from the sky. The fear was no longer, "Will they hit me?" but "There is nowhere to hide." This weapon didn't just kill soldiers, it killed their will to fight. The first deployment of the VT Fuze was a carefully guarded secret. It was issued to the U.S. Navy in 1943 for a single purpose: anti-aircraft defense. American ships, particularly aircraft carriers, were under constant attack by Japanese planes. Traditional anti-aircraft fire, relying on timed or impact fuses, struggled to hit a fast-moving target. On January 5, 1943, the cruiser USS Helena made history. As a Japanese Aichi D-3A Val dive bomber began its attack, the Helena's 5-inch guns opened up with VT-fused shells. On just the second salvo, a shell detonated close enough to the plane to shred it from the sky. The gunners aboard were stunned. They were used to firing hundreds, even thousands of rounds for a single kill. Now they had destroyed a target in seconds. When the desperate kamikaze attacks began in late 1944, the VT Fuze became the fleet's single most important defensive weapon. It created a nearly impenetrable flak barrier that Japanese pilots could not understand. They only knew that as they flew toward the American ships, they were swatted from the sky by an invisible, lethally precise force that blew their planes apart without a direct hit. But the U.S. Army was forbidden from using it on land. The fear was too great. If a dud shell fell into German hands, their scientists could reverse engineer it, or worse, develop a jammer. The weapon was too precious to risk. Everything changed in December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's surprise. Ardennes' offensive had shattered the Allied line. Dozens of German divisions, shielded by the worst winter weather in decades, which grounded Allied air power, were pouring through Belgium and Luxembourg. American troops were retreating, surrounded, and desperate. Their artillery, a huge advantage, was hampered by the thick snow and fog. Their standard impact shells were smothered by the deep snowdrifts, rendering them nearly useless. In desperation, the order was given: release the secret weapon. Shipments of VT Fuses, codenamed Posette, were rushed to the besieged artillery batteries. On Christmas Day, General George S. Patton, attempting to relieve Bastogne, authorized his artillery to use them for the first time. The result was a massacre. German infantry, advancing confidently across snow-covered fields, thought they were safe from American artillery. They were used to shells harmlessly burying themselves in the snow. Suddenly, the magic happened. The American shells began exploding above them, 20 yards off the snow. A lethal rain of shrapnel lashed down, wiping out entire platoons caught in the open. Captured Germans were bewildered. They spoke of magic shells and complained that the Americans were violating the laws of war by firing shells that exploded twice. They could not understand how American artillery, in a blizzard with zero visibility, could achieve perfect lethal airbursts. The VT Fuze, almost overnight, broke the back of the German infantry assault. The success in the Ardennes proved one thing indisputably: the VT Fuze was the most effective anti-personnel weapon ever invented. The secret was out. And with Germany collapsing, all restrictions were lifted. Now, the full power of this weapon would be turned on the final enemy, Japan. The theater shifted to the Pacific, to Iwo Jima in February 1945. This was the ultimate test. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had turned the volcanic island into a fortress. He had abandoned the beaches and ordered his 21,000 men to dig into the island. They created an 11-mile network of tunnels, 1,500 subterranean rooms, and countless hidden pillboxes, all interconnected. Japanese machine gun and mortar positions were sited in caves on the reverse slopes of Mount Suribachi and the northern highlands, immune to flat trajectory fire. The U.S. Marines landed and were immediately bogged down in a bloody, brutal war of attrition. They were fighting an enemy they could not see. An enemy who would weather the most intense bombardments in their bunkers only to emerge and fire into the Marines' backs. This is when the VT Fuze was unleashed. Marine artillery batteries, newly equipped with the shells, began targeting suspected Japanese positions. The effect was immediate and horrific. Japanese soldiers caught in open trenches or spider holes were simply erased. Mortar crews, moving between positions, were caught in the open and annihilated by the airbursts they could not comprehend. To the Japanese, this was impossible. They were used to surviving shellfire. They knew how to listen to the whistle and judge the fall. But now, the shells seemed to be hunting them, detonating at the perfect height to spray shrapnel down into every opening. The horror climaxed on Okinawa in April 1945. This was a far larger battle. With hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops entrenched in multi-layered defensive lines like the Shuri Line. This time, the Army and Marines used the VT Fuze on an industrial scale. They fired hundreds of thousands of rounds. Japanese gunners, like Sergeant Matsui's crew from the opening, felt it most acutely. They were masters of camouflage and entrenchment. They would place their artillery pieces in caves or on reverse slope revetments, wheel them out to fire a few rounds, and quickly wheel them back to safety before U.S. counter-battery fire could zero in. But the VT Fuze didn't need to hit the gun. It only needed to detonate above the gun's position. As a Japanese gun crew wheeled their cannon out of its cave, a VT Fused volley would arrive. The shells would detonate above them, wiping out the entire crew with a rain of shrapnel. The safe mouth of the cave was now a trap. American observers reported seeing Japanese gun crews completely eliminated, while their artillery pieces sat undamaged, untouched. The horror of being hunted by an unseen enemy, one that could strike from above at will, broke the Japanese defensive doctrine at its very foundation. As American infantry advanced to take Japanese strongpoints after a VT Fused barrage, the scenes they encountered were eerie and terrifying. They were used to seeing fortifications destroyed, bunkers collapsed, guns bent by blast. Now they found perfect tableaus of precise destruction. The trenches were intact. The sandbags were still stacked. The Japanese machine guns and mortars were often in perfect condition, sitting neatly on their mounts, undamaged by a direct blast. But all around them, the entire crews were dead, shredded by fragments that had rained down from above. Marine reports from Okinawa repeatedly described unscratched machine gun positions containing dead crews. For the American infantryman, this was an unbelievable relief. For years, they had paid in blood for every yard, making frontal assaults against dug-in machine guns. Now, their artillery could do the job that previously only infantry could: kill enemy infantry in their fortifications. Captured Japanese prisoners of war confirmed the psychological devastation. When interrogated, they could not explain the new weapon. They described it as a devilish power. They spoke of artillery shells that seemed to have eyes and that deliberately exploded directly overhead. They were convinced the Americans had developed some death ray or a form of magical control over their ammunition. The fear was not limited to the enlisted men. Captured Japanese intelligence reports from after the war showed complete confusion among the high command. They could offer no countermeasure. Their dig deep doctrine, the foundation of their entire Pacific defense strategy, had been nullified overnight. There was no way to train a soldier to defend against a weapon that could strike him from an impossible angle, from above, inside his safest refuge. After the war ended, Allied leaders were finally free to speak publicly about the secret weapon, and their assessments were stunning. General George S. Patton, who had seen it save the day in the Ardennes, declared that the VT Fuze, not any other weapon, was what enabled him to win the Battle of the Bulge. Admiral Lewis L. Strauss, who had overseen its production, went further. He called it one of the 3 weapons that turned the tide of the war, placing it alongside radar and the atomic bomb. He argued that without the VT Fuze, the Allied fleet would have suffered far heavier losses from Axis aircraft and kamikaze attacks, potentially delaying the war for months or even years. The true impact was measured in grim statistics. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, analyzing the campaigns, concluded that ground artillery using the VT Fuze saw its effectiveness against personnel in the open increase by 700% over conventional fuse. For anti-aircraft fire, the numbers were just as stark. Before the VT Fuze, it took an average of 2,000 rounds of 5-inch anti-aircraft ammunition to shoot down one plane. With the VT Fuze, that number dropped to under 50. It had saved countless Allied lives by replacing bloody infantry assaults with precise artillery strikes. It had shattered enemy morale and doctrine, turning their safest havens into tombs. And it had done it all in secret, a technological silver bullet that the Axis never saw, never understood, and could never counter. The VT Fuze was not just an improvement, it was a revolution that had reshaped the battlefield. War is always an arms race, a constant struggle between the measure and the countermeasure. The sword leads to the shield. The fortress wall leads to the cannon. And for thousands of years, the foxhole was the answer to artillery. It was a basic, almost physical truth of warfare. The earth would protect you. The VT Fuze ended that truth. It was a weapon that attacked not just the enemy, but the concept of safety itself. It represented a philosophical leap, the transition from dumb ordnance to smart weapons. For the first time, a shell didn't just fly, it sensed. It had an awareness of its environment, carrying its own tiny radar brain to the target. The scientists of Section T had given the American artilleryman a godlike capability, the power to strike from an impossible direction, to wipe out an enemy in his own sanctuary. The horror of that Japanese gunner in his bunker, realizing that there was nowhere left to hide, was the echo of a new age. This was not just a fuse, it was the birth of electronic warfare, a victory of physics and engineering that proved, in the final calculus, the smartest weapon wins.